Oh, it says unable to record. I'm kidding. Okay, here's what we're going to pick up. If there's a couple of the outlines, if you didn't get one last week, a couple of the outlines left. And what I did was, you'll recall, I kind of blew up what the last few chapters, last 9 chapters are of the book, so it'd be a little easier to follow. And we're going to be down in Roman numeral number 3 tonight in Caesarea. We actually aren't going to start in Caesarea. We're going to start in Jerusalem, where we're going to get relatively rapidly into Caesarea. And what we're going to do. We left off last week in chapter 23, and you might recall that was a rather humorous event where Paul's once again called before the Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin is going to call him on the carpet, and Paul kind of turns the tables on him, doesn't he? Do you remember that? It's kind of humorous event because they are going to query Paul, and Paul says, well, let's first talk about the resurrection. Guess who's sitting in the room with him? It's a Sanhedrin, right? That's composed of Pharisees and Sadducees. So the first thing Paul says is, well, before we talk about this, why don't we talk about the resurrection? Paul's no dummy. Paul's a Pharisee. The Pharisees believed in the resurrection. Sadducees did not. In fact, if you have the outline that I kind of put together about all the groups in Christ's time, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Herodians, if you take a look at that, you can almost just let's do it this way. You can put the Pharisees in the place of the Democrats and the Sadducees in the place of the Republicans, and you get the same thing. Whatever one's against, the other is for. So eventually, Paul says, not eventually, he says immediately, he doesn't even have to make any more of a case. He just kind of drops the bomb in the middle of them, and off they go. Well, we're going to pick up on what happens next. So we're going to start in chapter 23. We're going to look at verses 12 through 24. But I'm going to break it up into 3 more bite-sized pieces. I want to point out one thing, first of all, and that's this. Once again, it's going to be a Roman official that's going to save Paul's bacon. In the last couple of weeks, I've made the point about how many times it's a Roman official who's put between those who are looking to kill or otherwise get rid of Paul and Paul's journey. Here, it's going to be a tribune. In the past, we've had a centurion, and there's a huge difference here because a centurion, a centurion was in charge of 100 troops. A tribune was in charge of 1,000. So under him were 10 centurions, each with their own 100 men. So this is no mean official that's going to stand in the way. So after meeting with the Sanhedrin, Paul's now under a Roman guard by a guy by the name of Claudius Lysias. And Claudius Lysias is going to learn of a plot to kill Paul. So let's pick up in verse 12. It's going to be in chapter 23, verse 12. And we're going to go through just 15. I want to make 2 points. When it was day, so we've moved on from the night before with the catastrophe with the Sanhedrin. When it was day, the Jews made a plot and bound themselves by an oath, neither to eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. Excuse me. There were more than 40 who made the conspiracy. They went to the chief priests and elders and said, we have strictly bound ourselves by an oath to taste no food until we have killed Paul. Let me point out a couple things here. Do you notice it's the chief priests who go and recruit these guys? Not what happens, is it? These are 40 guys who come to the chief priests and say, here's what you're going to do. They're telling the chief priests and the elders who are Sadducees, they're going to tell them what to do. We don't have a lot of evidence of this, but we could probably find that out of that, you'll have to forgive me then. I've already got a cough drop, Deb. I'm not sure I can do anything else. Won't hurt if you want to. Thanks. I'll wash down the cough drop. Don't worry about it. Tuberculosis, not a big deal. So we can't, there's no biblical evidence, and I've told you over and over and over, never read anything into the Bible that's not in the Bible. So I'm going to tell you, this comes from the book of Tom. There's quite a few commentaries that believe the 40 are from the same group that have chased Paul all the way from Asia. You remember how throughout Asia, the Jews have come and he said, get rid of this guy, get rid of this guy. Whether it's the same 40 or not, we don't really know, nor do we much care. This is the group who said now to the leadership of the Jewish church, here's what you're going to do so that we can kill Paul. Now, if it's the chief priests and the elders, the leading group of the Sanhedrin, well, thanks, Tim. That did make a difference. Good job. Tastes strangely like vodka. So it's the chief priests and the elders who are doing this. The likelihood is this is mostly Sadducees, and that's a pretty fair guess because they would be the leadership of the Sanhedrin. Now, let's go on to verses 16 and 17. Now, and I wanted to point an interesting tidbit about this. Excuse me. Now, the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush, so he went and entered the barracks and told Paul. Paul called one of the centurions and said, take this young man to the tribune, for he has something to tell him. So he took him and brought him to the tribune and said, Paul, the prisoner, called me and asked me to bring you this young man. So guess who it is that is ultimately going to bring the word to the tribune? It's Paul's nephew. We don't have a whole lot of information about Paul's family. A pretty good chance that, if you think about it, knowing Paul, well, I started to make the case that knowing Paul, who's the first people he's going to preach the gospel to? Maybe the family. Once I got through saying that, I realized how good a job do I do preaching the gospel to the family. Actually, sometimes I think it's harder to preach the gospel to the family than to people that you don't even know. So I'm not even going to put this in the book of Tom, but there's a reason the nephew is there and the sister is there and they're in Jerusalem. So it's the nephew who brings the word to him, and Claudius hears of the plot from the nephew, and he takes steps to transfer Paul now from Jerusalem to Caesarea. At least in Caesarea, he can be pretty well protected. They're in Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, there are, can't tell you, well, during the feast days, there are up to 1 million Jews. In normal circumstances, probably a fairly small group, say 50,000, but it's going to be a lot safer in Caesarea than it is in Jerusalem. Now, I want to finish this up, finish a portion of it up by looking at the arrangements that are made. Move with me to verse 23. I want you to notice what happens here. Then he called two of the centurions. The he here is the tribune. Called two of the centurions and said, get ready 200 soldiers with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen, and go as far as Caesarea at the third hour of the night. Also, provide mounts for Paul to ride and bring him safely to Felix, the governor. And he wrote a letter to this effect. And then he's going to go on and write a letter to Felix saying, here's what needs to happen. We'll come back to that here in just a minute. Let me point out something about this. These are the arrangements. 200 horsemen, 200 soldiers. This is a pretty big entourage for one lonely Jew, isn't it? So the tribune knows what the issue is here. And he even, you'll notice, provides a mount. That's very unusual to provide a horse to transfer a prisoner. More importantly, and we'll get to that here in just a minute, is where Paul's going to be kept. Now, here's probably the main reason for all of this to occur. When Paul first met the tribune, what did the tribune find out about Paul? Do you remember that from a couple weeks ago? Paul's a Roman citizen. You remember that? We had the whole issue between the tribune saying, I had to pay for my way. And Paul said, well, I was born into it, probably from his father's line. So the tribune now knows that he's on slippery slope, not making sure that this Roman citizen who was afforded all the rights that we talked about before wasn't well protected. Now, I got to tell you that as I was writing this, here's what popped into my mind. And if you remember this, you're older than you think you are. Do you remember the old commercial? Membership has its privileges. Remember that?
Yeah, like it was yesterday.
Yeah, right. Well, to help fill things out for you, that was an American Express commercial back in the 80s. And back then, American Express was kind of probably one of the few big credit cards around. So if you have one of our cards that has its privileges, Paul has some privileges as a Roman citizen. That's why he gets this entourage like what you've seen. Now we're ready to make the trip from Jerusalem to Caesarea. So let's get over here. We have been in Jerusalem. We're going to go back to Caesarea. And then eventually we're going to start from Sidon. We're going to start our trip back to Rome. So now we're going to go, though, from Jerusalem to Caesarea where there's some more protection. And you'll get another interesting tidbit there. Let's look at verses 31 through 35, also in chapter 23. So the soldiers, according to their instructions, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. And then on the next day they returned to the barracks, letting the horsemen go on with him. When they had come to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they presented Paul also before him. On reading the letter, he asked what province he was from. And when he learned that he was from Cilicia, he said, I will give you a hearing when your accusers arrive. And he commanded him to be guarded in Herod's praetorium. Now, a few tidbits about that. Why would Felix really care where Paul was from? Probably because he's trying to get out of the assignment here. If he can prove that Paul's from someplace else, he can say, this isn't my problem. Unfortunately, Cilicia was also under the authority of Felix. So Felix says, all right, I guess I'll deal with this. But there's something even more interesting about this story, and here's what it is. Paul is going to be kept, and you'll notice at the end of verse 36, I will give you a hearing when your accusers arrive. And he commanded him to be guarded in Herod's praetorium. This is an artist's rendition of Caesarea. You see this kind of grand complex up here? Most people believe that's the praetorium. That was Herod's palace. Herod the Great rebuilt Caesarea. Now, if we go back to Herod the Great, we got to go all the way back to the beginning, to Christ's birth, right? So it's been there for some time. It's probably one of the most grand areas that there could be. Paul's going to be held there, and here's the bit of irony. Paul's going to be a guest in the praetorium. He's about to meet the high priest. So the high priest gets to come to see Paul in kind of this magnificence where he's going to have to deal with him. So we're now in Caesarea, in the praetorium, and now we can go on and see what happens with Felix in Caesarea. I want to start in chapter 24. We're going to look at verses 1 and 2. We're going to look at some more, but I need to do verses 1 and 2 for two reasons. One, to set the stage. Two, to make a correction of one of the dumbest things I've ever said. And I've said a bunch. Actually, we'll just yield to the authority and find out how many over the years. So let me read these two verses and I'll tell you the boondoggle I ran into. After the 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with some of the elders and a spokesman, one Tertullius. They laid before the governor the case against Paul. And when they had been summoned, Tertullius began accusing him by saying, so let me do my mea culpa first. I alluded to it in the email if you read that. Last week, you might recall, I equated Ananias with Annas. Do you remember that? That was a dumb thing to do, and I knew better. In fact, I went back and looked at some notes from a class I taught about this before and knew back then it was the wrong thing. Annas was the father of Caiaphas. He was there when Christ was crucified. So this is 20 years later. They can't be the same individuals. So I apologize for the mistake, but let me fill you in on who this guy is, this Ananias. So this is 20 years later, and we've gone through multiple high priests since then. Ananias is now the high priest. He's appointed about the time of the Jerusalem Council. If you remember the Jerusalem Council, that was, 10 years ago, something like that. He's probably appointed about the same time Paul was in Jerusalem. So whether Paul knew who he was or not, we don't really know. But what we do know is that Ananias is going to serve for 12 years, longer than almost all the other high priests who have a very short tenure in most cases. He is a friend of the Romans, and as a result, he's going to come to a rather quick dispatch when the beginning of the Jewish revolt breaks out in 66. We're not too far away from that. Ananias is actually going to be assassinated by the Jews because of his relationship with Rome. In the period of time from Christ until 70 AD, 70 AD is the end of the high priest. There's still a titular high priest for a number of years after that, but he doesn't have a temple. He has nothing he can do. So you can look at the end of the high priesthood at about 70. The riot begins in 66. It's quelled in 70. And finally, the end of it is 73 AD in Masada, which we've talked about before. So there's been 18 high priests, and it will be 18 high priests in that period of time. And I wasn't too far off about blaming Annas because guess what? 5 of those 18 are sons of Annas. If you throw Caiaphas in there, 6 of the 18. So now that I've kind of done my mea culpa, let me come back to what the verse is saying. I want you to note something. I go back to this and look at what it says. After 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders. Why didn't he bring the whole Sanhedrin? Well, I think after the first go-around with the Sanhedrin, he thought, I'm not doing that again. He's going to bring the guys that he can control and some kind of a lawyer. So he's not interested in having a repeat of the Sanhedrin. But he's still going to have the same rabble-rousers. Let me read verses 4 through 9, and we'll see what they do. We've heard this before, too. It's the same playbook that we've had throughout Asia. And then we'll see what the response is. Start with me in Acts 24. Look at verses 4 through 9. But to detain you no further, I beg you in your kindness. This is the lawyer, Tertullus, saying to Felix, to hear us briefly, for we have found this man a plague, one who stirs up riots among all the Jews throughout the world, and is a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to profane the temple, but we seized him. By examining him yourself, you will be able to find out from him everything about which we accuse him. The Jews also joined in the charge, affirming that all these things were so. I want to stop there and hit just a couple of points. They've done the same thing that they've done all along, haven't they? They've said, look, he's inciting riots all over the world. Now, there's a little bit of a exaggeration, I'd say. And then he says he even tried to desecrate the temple. He did not. What they saw him walking outside the temple precincts with one of the Gentiles he was with, and they tried to trump up all these charges. So they're taking all this to Felix, and we're going to find out something about Felix, who's quite corrupt, thinking we've got this guy over a barrel. I want you to look at Paul's response now with me. Paul's response is going to be very similar to what we've heard before. Start with me in verse 10. And when the governor had nodded to him to speak, Paul replied, knowing that for many years you have been a judge over this nation, I cheerfully make my defense. You can verify that it is not more than 12 days since I went up to worship in Jerusalem, and they did not find me disputing with anyone or stirring up a crowd, either in the temple or in the synagogues or in the city. Excuse me. Neither can they prove that what they now bring up against me. But this I confess to you, that according to the way, which they call a sect, I worship the God of our fathers, believing everything laid down by the laws and written by the prophets, having a hope in God, which these men themselves accept, that there will be a resurrection. I want to bring up something from Philippians, because what Paul has just said is this. By the way, Paul didn't shrink from the gospel, did he? He's standing in front of the Sanhedrin. He's standing in front of Felix. And what does he say? He says, but this I confess to you, that according to the way, which they call a sect, I worship the God of our fathers, believing everything laid down by the law and written by the prophets, having a hope in God, which these men themselves accept. He's going to go on and preach the gospel message. The reason I wanted to bring up Philippians 2, 10 through 11, says this. Every knee shall bow and every tongue confess. Paul's making the point that everyone at some point is going to understand what this is. Now, when I say every knee shall bow and every tongue confess, there's going to be two knees. There's going to be the one that is on the ground worshiping Jesus Christ. There's going to be the one on the ground pleading for their lives. Paul's making that case to Felix and to the Sanhedrin. Is everybody following me? That case is going to come at the end of time as well. Now, in verse 22 through 27, I want you to see Felix's response. And there's going to be a line in here that you're going to say, well, where does that come from? So Paul goes ahead and he goes through all this discussion about the resurrection of the dead and ultimately the belief in Jesus Christ. Let's look what Felix says in verse 22. But Felix, remember Felix is a Roman governor, right? But Felix, having a rather accurate knowledge of the way, put them off, saying, when Lysias, the tribune, comes down, I will decide your case. Then he gave orders to the centurion that he should be kept in custody, but have some liberty, and that none of his friends should be prevented from attending to his needs. After some days, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, and he sent to Paul, and he heard him speak about faith in Christ Jesus. And he reasoned about the righteousness and self-control and coming judgment. Felix was alarmed and said, go away for the present. When I get an opportunity, I will summon you. And at the same time, he hoped that money would be given him by Paul. So he sent for him and conversed with him. When 2 years had elapsed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus. And desiring to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. I want to go back and look at a couple of these things. Here's the first. This is Felix's response. By the way, Felix, Festus, Agrippa I, Agrippa II, Bernice, Ananias, Drusilla, all of these can be found in Josephus, an extra biblical book talking about them. It's just in the Bible. It's made up out of whole cloth from the Bible. Josephus talks about each one of these, and he tells a little bit about them. Not just Josephus, but we'll also find Suetonius, a Roman historian, will also talk about at least one of them. Let me point a couple things out. Let's go back to verse 22. Having a rather accurate knowledge of the way. Why in the world would Felix have any knowledge about the way? And I should probably also point out that the way is what Christians were called up to this point. It's not, and we talked about this before too, it's in Antioch, Syrian Antioch, when Paul and Barnabas are first dispatched in chapter 13, that they're finally called Christians. Everyone else referred to them as the way. You might notice the lawyer even referred to them as the way. So why would Felix know anything about this? Well, guess what? The Herods are back. We've looked at these guys before. So let me point out a couple things to you. Does everybody remember Herod Agrippa? We have to go all the way back. We can go back to Herod the Great, Aristobulus, all of these guys. We're going to eventually end up with Herod Agrippa I, who was probably the worst of the bunch. He's the one who kind of consolidates power everywhere. Ultimately, he's going to have a number of children, 3 of which are Herod Agrippa II, Bernice, and Drusilla. I don't know if you can read that from here, but here's what this says. Drusilla, the wife of Governor Felix. Man, these guys are all over the place, aren't they? Drusilla, and actually can point back to the Maccabees, and her line runs through the Maccabees. Do you remember when we talked about the Maccabees 200 years before the time of Christ? So this is all kind of a sorted little group that we're going to deal with from here on. In fact, we're about to meet Herod Agrippa II and Bernice, his sister wife. Boy, there's a, yeah, I was going to say, isn't there a TV show, Sister Wives? Yeah, wow. I didn't realize I was going to bring you into the 21st century here tonight. So the point to this is Festus knows something about what is happening in the way and Judaism. Notice something else. He keeps him under house arrest for 2 years. And finally, Felix is going to be replaced by Festus, who we're going to move to here in just a second, due to corruption. The Roman historian, Suetonius says something, but Tacitus is another Roman historian who writes this about Felix. He was cruel, licentious, and base. Felix is going to be recalled to Rome. And if it's not for his brother, he would have been probably beheaded for what he did throughout his tenure. But he's not going to be beheaded. He's going to end up in Rome, and he's going to be replaced by somebody named Festus. So now let's go to Paul before Festus. I want to break this up into 2 pericopes. We're going to be in chapter 25, and I want to look at Paul before Festus in 2 things. Start with me in chapter 25, and we're going to look at Acts 1 through 12. Chapter 25, 1 through 12. Now, there's one of our key words, and we're moving to a different pericope, aren't we? Now, 3 days after Festus had arrived in the province, he went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. And the chief priests and the principal men of the Jews laid out their case against Paul, and they urged him, asking a favor against Paul, that he summoned him to Jerusalem, because they were planning an ambush to kill him on the way. Festus replied that Paul was being kept in Caesarea, and that he himself intended to go there shortly. So, said he, let the men of authority among you go down with me, and if there is anything wrong about the man, let them bring charges against him. After he stayed among them not more than 8 or 10 days, he went down to Caesarea, and the next day he took his seat on the tribunal and ordered Paul to be brought. When he had arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many serious charges against him that they could not prove. Paul argued in his defense, neither against the laws of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I committed any offense. But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, do you wish to go up to Jerusalem and there be tried on these charges before me? But Paul said, I'm standing here before Caesar's tribunal, where I ought to be tried. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you yourself know very well. If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything for which you had deserved to die, I do not seek to escape death, but if there is nothing to the charges against me, no one can give me up to them. I appeal to Caesar. Then Festus, when he had conferred with his council, answered, to Caesar you have appealed, to Caesar you shall go. There's some pieces we need to notice about this. Festus is kind of a man of action, isn't he? It's only been 2 weeks, and Festus has already taken action. Felix had Paul sitting in prison for 2 years. Festus leaves him sitting in prison a little longer to go up to Jerusalem to say, what's going on, right? Well, so first of all, Festus is a man of action. Secondly, I want you to look at verse 8. Paul does this again really well. Paul argued in his defense, neither against the law or of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I committed any offense. Paul is saying, show me the crime. He's saying to a tribunal, show me where there is an offense. And then in verse 12, here's the kicker. And this is always going to be the kicker. In verse 12, then Festus, when he had conferred with his council, answered, to Caesar you have appealed, to Caesar you shall go. It's out of Festus's hands now. As a Roman citizen, that was one. You remember a couple of weeks ago we talked about the rights of a citizen? You had the right to appeal directly to Rome. You had the right to go straight to the Supreme Court with going out through all these other guys. So Paul says, I want to go to Rome. Festus no longer, the trial's over now. Festus can't do anything because his hands are tied. He's going to send Paul ultimately to Rome. But even though the trial is over, guess who shows up again? These guys. We'll come to that here in just a second. Excuse me. Start with me in verse 25, and we're going to look at verses 13 through 19, and then we'll talk a little bit about about Agrippa and some others. So in verse 25, excuse me, verses 13 through 19. Now, when some days had passed, Agrippa, the king, and Bernice arrived at Caesarea and greeted Festus. And as they stayed there many days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, there is a man left prisoner by Felix. And when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and elders of the Jews laid out their case against him, asking for a sentence to condemn against him. I answered them that this was not the custom of the Romans to give up anyone before the accused met his accusers face to face and an opportunity to make his defense concerning the charge against him. So when they came together here, I made no delay, but on the next day took my seat in the tribunal and ordered the man to be brought. When the accusers stood, they brought no charge in this case of such evils as I supposed. Rather, they had certain points of dispute about him, with him, about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who was dead, but whom Paul asserted to be alive. Well, so ultimately, what's going to happen is Festus is going to invite the Agrippas. Trial's over, nothing else to go on. Festus isn't real sure what this is all about, but you notice what Festus just said? There's nothing against Roman law that we can even talk about here. Why am I even here? In Rome, as we've talked about, as long as you paid your taxes, no insurrection, you were okay. So as far as Festus was concerned, why was the guy even here to begin with? But he wants to know a little bit more of the story. In verses 16 and 17, I want you to notice something about Festus. Festus is a fair man. He said, I'm going to give him his trial. You can't do anything in Roman law without a fair trial. And then once he heard what the accusations were, he said, there's nothing I can hold this man on. The second thing is that we should point out, Paul's a Roman citizen, which we've talked about before. And finally, in verses 18 and 19, and Festus recognizes this more than anybody else. He says in verses 18 and 19, when the accusers stood up, they brought out no charge in his case of such evil as I suppose. Rather, they had certain points of dispute with him about their own religion. This is and it's been all along, it's been the same thing. This is what's called an internecine affair. Internecine simply means an affair between two parties of the same group. The term actually means to kill between. And Festus's point is, these are Jews. He doesn't make any differentiation between Christian and Jew. He said, these are Jews. Why do I have anything to do with it? Now, let's look at we're going to look at the Agrippas, but probably the best argument or the best presentation of the Damascus Road account anywhere. In chapter 26, verses 1 through 23. I'm not going to read all of that. I'm going to read pieces of it. But before we do that, we should probably figure out who this guy Agrippa is. And we saw him a few minutes ago. Agrippa remains ruler over a portion of the what would now be called Palestine. It's a little difficult to make out on this map. This area right here, by this time is called Trichonitis or Trichonitis. There is another place above here called Abilene. Agrippa the second is the ruler over those areas. Has no authority whatsoever in anything going on in Israel, which is where Festus rules. So Festus is simply wanting to find out what Agrippa knows about all this. That's why Agrippa's there to begin with. There's no legal authority, but most most theologians, most writers, historians will say he was probably the most knowledgeable of Judaism than anybody in the Herod line. He knew more about the Old Testament and Judaism than anybody in the Herod line. So now we get what I'm going to call, and I told you this, I gave you this phrase last week, but you're probably wondering, what the world is he talking about? We're going to talk about something called Paul's stump speech. Now, this is, I've already done one mea culpa tonight. I might as well do another one. Years ago, I used to run political campaigns. A couple of gubernatorial ones. I was involved in one Senate campaign. I was even marginally involved in George Bush Sr.'s presidential campaign. Well, in running those campaigns, we had something that we called a stump speech. A stump speech is one that is a fairly patterned speech that the candidate will give wherever he goes if he's going into a new area, unless he's going to release something major. He goes into the new area and he says, I'm such, and here's why I'm here, and here are the things I believe in. This is Paul's stump speech. We could probably envision Paul doing the same kind of something very similar to this in every synagogue he went into. That's why it's one of the best renditions. There's 3 different times that the Damascus Road is recounted. This is probably the best of the bunch. I'm just going to hit the high points of it. So start with me. And by the way, the last verse is always the killer. In verse 26, 1 through 9, I'm not going to read it, but what Paul's going to do is he's going to establish his bona fides. He's going to say, remember he's talking now before Festus and Agrippa and Bernice and probably some others there. He's going to say, I was Jew of the Jew, Hebrew of the Hebrews, from the tribe of Benjamin. I taught about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I taught about the prophets. So he's going to establish his bona fides. It's exactly the same thing you do in a stump speech. And then he ends it by saying, I even went as far as to ask the rulers, the Sanhedrin, to let me pursue Christians. So he's gotten to that point, and now we're going to look at the Damascus Road experience from Paul's perspective. We're going to do verses 12 through 23. So start with me in chapter 26, verse 12. In this connection, what he's just ended up so far by saying he even asked for letters to go to find the other Christians. So now he's going to say, in this connection, I journeyed to Damascus with the authority of and commission of the high priest. At midday, O king, I saw on the way a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, that shone around me and those who journeyed with me. And when we had all fallen to the ground, I heard a voice saying to me in the Hebrew language, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. And I said, who are you, Lord? And the Lord said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But rise and stand upon your feet, for I have appeared to you for this purpose, to appoint you as a servant and witness to the things in which you have seen me and those in which I will appear to you, delivering you from your people and from the Gentiles, to whom I am sending you, to open their eyes so that they may turn from their darkness to light and from the power of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me. Therefore, O King Agrippa, so now he's given his Damascus Road experience. If you go back and read through the other two versions, you're going to find some things in here that Paul says, like, I don't think in the other two you find anything about him kicking against the goats. The other two, he says it's done in the Hebrew language. So Paul gives the best account. This is an eyewitness account, right, of the Damascus Road experience. Now he's ready to go back to Agrippa, and here's what he says. Therefore, O King Agrippa, I was not disobedient to the heavenly vision. Agrippa is going to understand this because Agrippa, knowing the Old Testament, is going to know how God appeared to the prophets, but declared first to those in Damascus, then in Jerusalem, and throughout all the region of Judea, and also to the Gentiles. What was the requirement of the apostles all the way back in the beginning of Acts? Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. What did he just say? He said exactly that, didn't he? For this reason, the Jews seized me in the temple and tried to kill me. To this day, I have had the help that comes from God. And so I stand here testifying both to small and great, saying nothing but what the prophets and Moses should have said would come to pass, that the Christ must suffer, that by being the first to rise from the dead, he would proclaim the light both to our people and to the Gentiles. I'm going to stop there for a minute. I don't want this to be lost on you. And there's a point in here where Paul even says to Agrippa, don't you see the whole case here? And Agrippa says, am I too soon to become a Christian? I think Agrippa is getting a lesson here. Agrippa up to this point has said, I understand every piece of this. And Agrippa has got to have known what the way was all about, saying what the Messiah was, right? So that's what Paul has just done before one of the authorities in Judaism. But I want to come to the last part of this, the last few verses, because this is where the rubber is going to meet the road. Turn to Acts 26, verses 30 to 32 with me. Then the king rose, and the governor, and Bernice, and those who were sitting with them. And when they had withdrawn, they said to one another, I want you to listen to this, this man is doing nothing to deserve death or imprisonment. And Agrippa said to Festus, this man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. Now you've got the highest authority in the land, Festus, and the highest Jewish authority and man of knowledge of the Old Testament saying, this man has done nothing wrong. Now, I won't read into this, but I'll give you my thoughts on it. Would Agrippa have said something like that if he didn't think there was something to this whole story of this Christ guy? Well, now Paul is destined, isn't he? Paul's going to get his wish. God had told him, you're going to Rome. Paul's going to get his wish, right? That's where we'll kind of wrap up our story from Caesarea to Rome. So let's move on to the Roman, let me find it here. Paul's journey to Rome. I'm going to pick up in chapter 27 with the trip beginning in verses 1 through 3. Chapter 27, verses 1 through 3. So we're going to leave Caesarea, and the trip begins. And when it was decided that we should sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and some prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius, and embarking in a ship out of Tinium, which was about to sail to the ports along the coast of Asia, we put out to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus a Macedonian from Thessalonica. The next day we put into Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and to be cared for. I want to point out a couple of things here. Here's the first thing. You notice it said, and Paul sailed? It didn't say that. What did it say? And we sailed. Remember we talked so many times about the we verses? There are 4 citations. It's Luke. Luke's with Paul now. Luke will be with Paul all the way to Rome. That's the first thing to notice. The second thing to notice is these Roman soldiers are really tough guys, right? And Julius, the centurion, treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and to be cared for. Notice what his last action is before he leaves on the trip to Rome. He goes back to encourage his friends and those disciples of him as they encourage him. So first of all, Luke's with him. Secondly, once again, and Julius is going to be here for the whole voyage, by the way. Julius, a centurion soldier, looks kindly upon him. Thirdly, Paul does the same thing he's been doing all along. He goes back and encourages the brothers. Now, let me just kind of recount the trip for you here. If you have your maps, they're probably easier to see. We're going to go from Caesarea Maritima to Sidon. That's where Paul's going to be now. And then that ship that we talked about is going to go along the coastline here. The ship is actually up here somewhere around Asia is where it was homed. And it stayed along the coastline. The reason that they're going to shift to ships here is because the ship that Paul is on is probably a smaller ship that's going to take grain and whatever else around. Now he's going to shift to a larger ship and begin the journey to Crete across the Mediterranean. And in the Mediterranean at this time of year, in fact, it'll even talk about it. The winter time of the year was perilous. I think it still is, probably not as much as you'd worry about if you were not on a sailing vessel. Eventually, they're going to end up in Malta and then on to Rome. So that's kind of the big picture of where we're going to be. So now let's go to the shipwreck. I want to look at, so that's the trip, basically. But let's get to the shipwreck because the voyage is important and there's important things about it. If you haven't read it, you need to read through it. But I want to get to the shipwreck because there's a couple of pieces here that we need to look at. And I'm going to do it in 2 pericopes. You want to turn to chapter 27. And we're going to look first at verses 30 through 44. I'm going to look at total verses 30 through 44, but in 2 pericopes. Here's the first one, verses 30 through 38. So in chapter 27, start in verse 30. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship. So let me fill in a little bit on this. The ship has floundered all across here. It's about to sink. They've thrown off cargo. They've gotten rid of everything they can possibly do. They're trying to save lives now. And here's where we pick up. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship and had lowered the ship's boat into the sea under pretense of laying out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay in this ship, you cannot be saved." A little double entendre there, by the way. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship and let it go. So the centurion intercedes. He won't let the sailors get off the ship. And look at what happened. As day was about to dawn, Paul urged them all to take some food, saying, "Today is the 14th day that you have continued in suspense without food, having taken nothing. Therefore, I urge you to take some food, for it will give you strength. For not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you." And when he had said these things, he took bread and giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. Then they all were encouraged and ate some food themselves. There were in all 276 persons in the ship. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, throwing out the wheat into the sea. Let me hit a couple points here. Who's running this show? Paul, right? Paul's the one who says, "Don't let them cut the boats loose." Paul's the one who says, you guys need to eat because you're going to be saved. It's Paul who's going to give, and then he's going to give thanks to the Lord. He's going to have the Lord's Supper right there with him. In verse 35, he gives thanks to the Lord. He continues to testify. So 3 points about this. Who's running the show? It's Paul. Nah, it's not Paul. Who is it? Second thing is, he gives thanks to the Lord, and in doing so, testifies to, and it tells us how many there are there, 276 men on this ship. How many of them are Christian? Probably not any, except maybe Paul. But they're about to be. In fact, I guess you could say we see both ordinances here. We see the Lord's Supper and we see baptism. And the third point I wanted to make was this. And the reason I want to do this. I want you to note the specificity. You notice Paul doesn't say, it's been a couple of weeks, does he? He says it's been 14 days. And then it says 276 persons were on the ship. Why would I bring that up? 2 reasons. This is an eyewitness account. Who's there? Luke. Secondly, this again points to the veracity, not just of Luke and Acts, but all the New Testament writings. Now let's look at our second pericope, starting in verse 39 through 44. Now, when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach on which they had planned, if possible, to run the ship ashore. So they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea, at the same time loosening the ropes that tied the rudders. Then hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. But striking a reef, they ran the vessel aground. The bow struck and remained immovable, and the stern was broken up by the surf. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for land, and the rest on planks or on pieces of the ship. And so it was that some were brought safely to land. What? I must have got the cheap version again. It says all, doesn't it? Well, we're going to see God's hand of protection. More importantly, I want to take you back to a verse that we didn't read. Same chapter, but go back with me to verse 23. For this very night there stood before me an angel of God, to whom I belong and to whom I worship. And he said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on some island. Paul told him the night before, you're all going to make it. And why? Because of the God he believed in. All right, we're getting very close to Rome. In fact, let's get there now. We're going to be in the arrival of Rome. So we're going to skip to chapter 28. We're going to look at verses 11 through 31. I want to focus on verses 17 through 19. We're not going to read all of it. I want to focus on verses 17 through 19 and 23 through 27. Actually, I do want to read it all if you'll hang with me here. Pick up with me in chapter 28, verse 11. So they wreck on Malta, an island, and they're there for some time. In fact, you're going to hear this. After 3 months, we set sail in a ship that wintered in the island, a ship of Aleksandr, two gods as a figurehead. Putting into Syracuse, we stayed there for 3 days. And from there we made the circuit and arrived at Rhegium. And after 1 day, a south wind sprang up, and on the 2nd day we came to Puteoli. There we found brothers and were invited to stay with them for 7 days. And so we came to Rome. And the brothers there, when they had heard about us, came as far as the Forum of Appius and the 3 taverns to meet us. On seeing them, Paul thanked God and took courage. And when he came into Rome, Paul was allowed to stay by himself with the soldiers who guarded him. Excuse me. Now, I want to pick up in verse 17. We have kind of the background for it. I want to pick up in verse 17. After 3 days, he called together. By the way, let me go back for a minute. Did you notice Paul said I ran into brothers? Brothers in this case, brothers can be used a number of ways in the Bible. One is literal brothers. Second is brothers in terms of Judaism. Paul uses the term brothers here. He's talking about Christian brothers, Jew or Gentile. Here's the question. Why were they there? How did they end up being there? Paul had never been to Rome. In fact, nobody knows who founded the church in Rome. But when Paul gets there, who does he meet? Brothers. Notice what he does next. Pardon?
It's a coincidence.
It is another coincidence. Notice, I want you to, I hope you find this humorous. I do. After 3 days, he called together the local leaders of the Jews, and when they had gathered, he said to them, "Brothers, though I had done nothing against our people or the customs of our fathers, yet I was delivered as a prisoner from Jerusalem into the hands of the Romans." We'll do through verse 19. When they examined me, they wished to set me at liberty because there was no reason for the death penalty in my case. But because the Jews objected, I was compelled to appeal to Caesar, though I had no charge to bring, though I had no charge to bring against my nation. For this reason, therefore, I have asked to see you and to speak with you. Guess where Paul is? Back to the very beginning. He called together the local leaders of Paul's back in the synagogue. He's doing the same thing he did every trip he went to. He's going to reason with the Jews. He's got brothers there already, but what does he do? He knows his job. He's going to start there. And then look what happens in verses 23 through 27. When they had appointed a day for him, he talked to them about, "I want to come and speak to you more." When the Jews had appointed a day for him, they came to him at his lodging in greater numbers. From morning till evening, he expounded to them, testifying to the kingdom of God and trying to convince them about Jesus, both from the law of Moses and from the prophets. And some were convinced by what he said, but others disbelieved. And disagreeing among themselves, they departed after Paul had made one statement. "The Holy Spirit was right in saying to your fathers through Isaiah the prophet," and I'm going to read exactly what he says here. In other words, Paul has had time with the Jews. You'll notice some have said, "You're right, that is the Messiah." Some have said, "You're not." So what's Paul do? He goes back to the highest regarded prophet of the Old Testament, and here's what he said. Isaiah was right, and he's talking to the Jews that refused to believe. He says, "Go to this people and say, you will indeed hear, but never understand. And you will indeed see, but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull, and with their eyes they can barely hear, and with their ears they can barely hear, and with their eyes they have closed, lest they should see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their heart and turn, and I would heal them. Therefore, let it be known to you that this salvation of God has been sent to the Gentiles, and they will listen." So, Paul quotes Isaiah. He's also quoting Jesus. Jesus says practically the same thing in Matthew 13, 14 through 15. But I want to point out something here. He says, "Go to this people and say, you will indeed hear but never understand. You will indeed see but never perceive." This was written to people 2,000 years ago. Has nothing to do with us today. Isn't that exactly what's happening today? Isn't this exactly what we see today? The very same thing. So, in verse 28, we can kind of end this. I still have the rest of the story and a little bit more to do, but I want to end it this way. Therefore, let it be known to you that this salvation of God has been sent to the Gentiles, and they will listen. You can summarize all of Acts this way. Preach the gospel. Repeat. 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 But there is a bit of an epilogue. So let me spend just a bit of time there. We can't just leave Paul here. And here's where our epilogue is. Paul arrested and imprisoned. He's going to be under house arrest for this period of time. Paul's voyage to Rome. I'm sorry, that was when he was in Caesarea. He's going to be in Rome. Paul in Rome. Paul's martyred in 68 AD. In the meantime, guess what's happened? The gospel has blown up around the world. Not just Paul, but all the other apostles, all the other disciples. The reason that we're left here is Luke is with Paul up to this point. Luke likely now is going to be dispatched either to Philippi, mostly Philippi, or one of the other churches, possibly to help Timothy in Ephesus. We don't get any of the rest of the story, and the rest of the story is Paul will be martyred, as will Peter, under Nero's reign. But the gospel is going to continue to burn. The gospel is going to continue to blow up. And that kind of brings us to the summary, which I wrote out for you on the bottom of this, and that's this. Some of you have been here for the intertestamental period, the period of 400 years before. Some of you have just joined us. But here's the point to all of this. God set in motion everything that he was going to need, not just for the arrival of his son, but for the spread of his message in the first century, beginning 400 years. And I would make the case 722 years before that. He set in motion everything that he was going to need. The effects of his steps that we see back then, all of them can be found in Acts. And that's why we've connected everything we can to the book of Acts, back to that 400-year period. And if you don't leave this room with anything else, please leave this room with three things. One, the diaspora, the dispersion of the Jews beginning around 722. That's going to give Paul and all the other apostles a ready-made place to go find people to spread the gospel. In other words, the first missionaries. That's the first thing to keep in mind. Second thing to keep in mind is Hellenization. If it weren't for Alexander the Great requiring the whole known world to know and understand the Greek language, Paul would have had to have known, I can't tell you how many languages to go into each one of these areas. So the language is the second thing that happens, because Paul can now spread the message in one language that everyone is going to understand. And here's the third thing. We've talked about this quite a bit. The Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. From 27 BC, when Caesar Augustus comes to power, through the first and second centuries AD. It's the peace of Rome that allows the voyages that we've looked at, that allows Paul to move about safely, that allows Paul to have centurions, tribunes, and governors stand up for him. So if you don't leave with anything else, please leave with this. God had set in motion everything he would need for the spread of the gospel 400 years before the time of Christ. Amen? Amen. Well, then guess what? We're done. Amen as in thank the Lord, we're done. All right. Any easy questions?
Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
Well, thank you. And you guys being here is just icing on the cake. And by the way, you got a lot of things you could be doing, so I really do thank you for it. But I have to tell you, the love is in putting it on, doing the research to put it all together. Because I learned twice as much as I'm ever able to get out. But thank you for being here.
So what's next?
Well, I don't know for sure. I told Brother James that we're going to take the summer off, not necessarily for me, but you need to relax for need a relaxation for me. I can't tell you what's going to happen. All I can tell you is, Buddy said, yes, you need to do a class in the fall. I'm going to meet with him to find, I'm not sure what we'll do yet. I want to meet with him to find out where he's going after. Why don't we do the book of John? Buddy's, he promised me he's on the road to finishing up John. So I'm going to meet with him to find out where he's going next. And what I will likely try to do is find something that is a companion to it, whatever he teaches. So whatever he's teaching won't be the same book, won't be the same thing he teaches, but if I can find a companion to it, that's probably what I would do. As an example, if he's going to teach, Genesis, Exodus, and Leviticus, I would probably go to Deuteronomy, which is a summary of all of those. So I can't tell you what it's going to be. All I can tell you is stay tuned, and thanks so much for spending time with me.
You don't want to do Revelation?
Let's do that, not.
Have you done it? Have you done Revelation?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry I missed that.
I have the videos.
You're fine.
All right.